You know, fear can be a powerful influencer. Fear can influence thought. Fear can influence emotions. It can influence behaviors. Fear can challenge your vision, how we see circumstances, people, and even reality. Fear can impact our present and even negatively impact our future. Our next door neighbor has a giant bull mastiff named Rock. Rock can be intimidating at first sight. He's a beautiful dog whose head is about, 3 times the size of mine. Rock likes to bark and run. He can be aggressive from time to time. He's, after all, a dog. He's a bull mastiff. And personally, I am quite grateful that there is a fence that separates Rock from me. But generally, the kids, Liam and Lillian, generally they're not afraid of Rock. They see him not as a threat, but really as just a big baby. He comes out of the house, he starts barking and running up and down the fence. And Lillian will just walk up to the fence and start talking to him. Hey, Rock, how are you doing, Rock? Hey, Rock. Now, part of her not being afraid of Rock has to do with her relationship with him. The kids know him, and they know his owner. So often, we are taught fear. We are taught how to fear, when to fear, who to fear, what to fear. Fear is modeled for us. I'm pretty sure that Liam's fear of roller coasters has something to do with a few things he's heard me say over the years. Some people fear spiders or snakes or the dark or heights. Others fear death and loneliness. Some even fear fear itself. But there are some who fear other people. Ever make sure your doors are locked when driving in a part of town that you don't know or you feel uncertain about? Do you know what it's like to be pulled over by the police, certain, absolutely certain that you did not break a law? Human beings have long had this tendency to fear others. Others who do not look like them, others who don't talk like them, others who don't have the same belief system as them, the same background, experience, or even expectations of them. Fear is the response to the manifestation of a threat. I feel threatened by heights. I feel threatened by snakes. I feel threatened by spiders. I feel threatened by death and loneliness. I feel threatened by the unknown. Therefore, I fear. You threaten me, so I fear. Your very presence threatens me, so I'm afraid. I am afraid that I will lose power. I am afraid that I will lose influence. I am afraid that I will somehow lose identity. So I fear you, and I fear your very presence. And these fears can turn violent and even deadly. We've seen that throughout the course of history and time. We have seen that in American history. We are experiencing that right now in our country, in our society, in our culture, and even in our community today. Often, we fear what we do not know. And Pharaoh did not know Joseph. He didn't know who he was. He didn't know his story. He did not know how Joseph had won favor with God or with the former king. He didn't know that it was in fact Joseph who saved the people, who saved the resources, who saved the very land he would come to rule. He didn't know. He didn't know that Joseph's descendants, those dreaded and loathed and feared Israelites who lived among the Egyptians, were actually invited to be there. They were welcomed. They had become a part of the fabric of Egypt. He didn't know any of that. All he did know was that he just had to deal with them somehow. So how did he address his fears? He lied. He just lied. He spread fake news. He deceived and manipulated and spread his fears to others. These Israelites, these foreigners, they outnumber us, he began to say. We need to do something about it, or else they might overtake us. They may overcome our way of life. By the way, the Israelites did not really outnumber the Egyptians. They didn't. But the Egyptians still enslaved the Israelites. They created work camps. They forced them into labor and servitude, all because of a lie created out of fear. Pharaoh attempted to break their backs and to break their spirits, but the Israelites continued to multiply and to grow. And as the Israelites grew, so did the fear of Pharaoh. So an executive order was signed and sent throughout the land, down to the Hebrew midwives. An executive order that said that when the Hebrew women give birth, if it's a girl, let it live. But if it's a boy, kill it. But two of the midwives, Shiphrah and Puah, they rejected the order. They chose to resist. They resisted fear. They resisted bigotry. They resisted persecution. They resisted murder. They resisted the behavior of an unscrupulous dictator king. And they did so, by lying. They lied. But when called before Pharaoh and questioned about their lie, they responded by saying, look, these Hebrew women, they're like nothing we have ever seen before. They are tough. They are giving birth before the midwives can even get there. So going beyond just the midwives, this time Pharaoh spread the fear to the entire people of Egypt. He created this mob mentality by saying to all the people, if you see a Hebrew baby, if it's a girl, you can let it live. But if it's a boy, throw it in the Nile. Empire-sanctioned genocide. Sometimes our fears have a way of getting the better of us, and such was the case with Pharaoh. All of this set up the events surrounding the birth of Moses. Born to the house of Levi and hidden out of sight for 3 months, placed in a homemade paper ark and watched over by his big sister Miram, this Moses would be the one, with the help of God, to lead the Hebrew people out of slavery in Egypt. Now, for the next several weeks, we're going to follow the story of Moses and the Israelite people from slavery to liberation. It was a slavery that originated from fear. And fear, y'all, fear has a way of doing that. Fear has a way of keeping people hostage, holding them captive. Fear has a way of manifesting itself in irrational and in sometimes violent ways. But the Moses story has something else within its origin. In the midst of all of that fear, in the midst of all of that violence, in the midst of all of that mess, the story of Moses and Shiphrah and Puah, the midwives who chose not to give in to fear, and as a result found favor with God. The origin story of Moses has the older sister, Miriam, who watches over the infant Moses and ensures that her mother and her brother would indeed be cared for in, of all places, the house of Pharaoh. You know, in the midst of fear, in the midst of great fear, God sometimes has a way of placing within the midst of all of that fear, right there in the middle of it, people who show us another way of living and being. Sometimes God acts. Sometimes God is revealed through unexpected folk to show us that fear will not win. That sometimes a choice has to be made between fear and faith. Shiphrah, Puah, and Miram, they all made a conscious choice. Was there some amount of deceit in their voice? Yes, there was, and we have to claim that. But that deceit was for a greater purpose. They chose the side of life and faith rather than the side of fear. They chose the side of liberation and not the side of oppression and bigotry. Through these women, God sets into motion acts of liberation and life. These women chose a side because God chose a side. Now maybe we do not like to think of a God as one who chooses sides. We want God to be impartial. We want our God to be right down the middle. And if God does happen to choose a side, well, let's be honest about that. We hope that God will choose our side. But perhaps we're thinking about that all wrong. Maybe rather than wanting God to be on our side, we should worry more about being on the side of God. A God who pulls time and time and time again for the underdog. A God who time and time and time again chooses the side of the marginalized, the poor, the sick, the children, the immigrant, the foreigner. You know, one day Jesus walked into church and he opened up the scroll of Isaiah and he read these words. He said, I have come to proclaim good news. I have come to proclaim the gospel to the poor. I've come to proclaim the gospel to the poor. Freedom to those who are in prison. Recovery of sight to those who are blind. And release to those being held captive. And then Jesus sat down. And then after he sat down, the church tried to run him out of town. And then the church tried to kill him. They tried to run him out of town. They tried to kill him because they were angry. And they were angry because they were afraid. Because they were afraid of what this gospel, this good news that Jesus came to fulfill, came to proclaim, they were afraid of what this gospel would do. They were afraid of what this gospel would mean for their power, their control, their agenda, their identity, and their. So choosing sides is not an easy thing to do. Choosing the side of God, God who has chosen to take the side of those we so often discard and revile and persecute, can put you in some unwanted places. It can deepen fear and anxiety. It can make you the focus of someone else's fears. But I'll tell you what else. It will also put you in a faithful place. It will put you in a faithful place. Faithful to the gospel. Faithful to your calling. faithful to God. So y'all, don't give power to fear. And especially, don't give power to the fears of others. Especially, do not give power to the fears of others when those fears manifest themselves through hatred and violence and bigotry. My hope and prayer for each of us, every single one of us here, every single one of us, and all throughout God's beautiful creation, my hope and prayer is that in the midst of whatever we might fear, that before it's too late, God will place within that journey, God will be made known, God will act in the form of the unexpected and the unlikely. That God will prove that once again, fear has no place in our journey of faith. I pray that God will show us another choice, another way of being church, another way of being Christian. I don't know, though. There just seems to be a lot of fear in our world. So much so that it just feels like we can no longer remain neutral. We can't afford to. It just does not seem faithful to remain neutral any longer. It is just not faithful to sit still. It's not faithful to sit quiet while fear has its day. So I guess there's no choice but to choose sides. And so I pray we all shall choose the side of God, the side of faith. Choose the side of a God revealed in Jesus, a God of hope and love and grace and mercy, a God of welcome, a God of justice, a God who sees the suffering of God's people and responds. Who responds with life and with liberation. Amen.